stuff out that is a little bit less fragile. So this is where researchers like yourselves can come do work. And then if there's anything more you want, then our staff comes back into what I call the vault, which has all of the materials, and we will bring those out for you. So we have a lot of our more fragile things here. These are scrapbooks that alumni have donated. And then I'm gonna grab some leaves from back here.
Whatever we do for the project, we have to be using some of these fonts because these are
I know, right?
They're so good.
Yeah. I don't know why they didn't keep it. Like, there's some cool ways that they used to write with that.
Oh wait, I love this.
The search through Lasell Leaves was the most interesting project I've done this entire semester. I have never visited the Lasell archives before, and getting to look at the physical, the ads, the yearbooks was super, super interesting. And it really piqued my curiosity about how different and similar Lasell is now to back then.
You have to remember, at this time, it was all women who had money that could go to Lasell. So if you're thinking about what you should advertise to women who have money.
This specific volume has a lot of advertisements. Afternoon tea.
This store that sold skirts for women. C.F. Hovey Company. The owner, C.F. Hovey, was a prominent abolitionist during the time.
I mean, it would be interesting to know if there were any black students at Lasell.
Yeah.
Our first black student at Lasell was
In the 1950s.
or 60s.
We first looked into the Lasell Winslow Archives digital collection, and that first initial process kind of piqued my interest. And I was able to find my first lead, an ad for Elmer Chickering, a photographer at the time around 1890, who actually was in charge of taking the class photo for Lasell Seminary School in 1893. And that was really the first thing that piqued my interest and really got me going.
So when we started this project, it was mainly just going to be about Auburndale itself and the businesses around and the different shops that people from Lasell might have gone to or visited. We looked at different ads. Matt ended up finding this photography ad for Elmer Chickering. This kind of changed our project. We ended up going down this route of focusing on more like fashion and photography and general like beauty standards and things like this.
So some of the things that we have that I pulled out for you to look at today are newspapers, high school yearbooks, which these are from like 1910, 1915, and 1920. Great pictures of hairstyles, fashion, that sort of thing, right? The Newton directories, these city directories are a font of information. Often there are advertisements in the back, right, for local and Boston businesses. It tells you who is living at what address and where they work and what they do. Great information.
Some of them say where the person was born too, I think.
Yeah,
or if they moved, they'll say removed to wherever they went, which
right.
is kind of amazing.
This is a great book. I looked up Chickering. In here there are a couple of images and some information about all of the different places that he had studios. This is how I store photographs and postcards, and this entire box is full of Auburndale images.
And then going through like the archives and stuff, I was looking through the directory and just seeing like how they listed, you know, people's professions and who was living in the house fully and how they were like sort of related into each other and all that.
When we went on our trip to the Jackson Homestead, that's kind of what piqued my interest the most, getting to look around the homestead and see it in general. But there was one specific photograph that we found that I was like, wow, I drive down this street every day and it looks so different here. And it was actually a photo of Woodland Road. I don't recall who found it, but I know someone else did. And I just found that picture so pretty. And I just couldn't help but compare the two images.
Maybe that's where east-west was? Or...
No, east-west would be like over here. This would be like Woodland. And then the admissions building.
Okay.
I think I would imagine.
It's just because that looks like a hill. Maybe they got rid of it.
Because
Or terraformed it?
Gardner's on the hill, and that's right behind Woodland.
Yeah, you're right.
So probably the most frustrating part for me during this whole research process was trying to figure out where we were going to go with the research, especially when we went to the Jackson Homestead. We went in looking for a lot of leads on fashion and hairstyles at the time, because we thought they would have a lot of information on that. But then I picked up the 1910 edition of the Auburndale Village Improvement Society pamphlet, and I fell down a rabbit hole, and I ended up finding pictures of Woodland Road, of the original Bragdon Hall, the original Woodland Park Hotel, which would later become Woodland Hall.
I was wondering where I was going to go with my research. I wanted to know who owned the houses, and I wanted to know how they got into Lasell's possession, but I wasn't too sure how to figure that out. Luckily, the librarian gave us a book called Lasell, A History of the First Junior College for Women, and it actually gave me a lot of information about the owners, Mr. Eager and Dr. Bragdon, and why the Carradine House wasn't on the 1886 map that we looked at, and why it's named the Carradine House instead of the Bragdon House.
So our initial goal when going to the Jackson Homestead ended up changing again from our initial goal. We wanted to see the greater Auburndale history there, because this is the Newton Historical Society's their archive, and we ended up seeing a lot of old photographs of Lasell and the streets around Lasell, like Commonwealth Ave. We ended up seeing interesting photos of like streetcars going through Lasell, and this was a really powerful experience because we all got to see these buildings that we've been in like hundreds of times and how drastically they've changed or even stayed the same. So this ended up diverting our second initial focus back to Lasell and back to the Lasell archives.
I think it was really cool to see Lasell specific archived pictures compared to Newton Auburndale specific archived pictures. So I think comparing the two, looking at the building, streets, something like that was really cool. I think, however, one stumbling point or one roadblock that we had was kind of just pinpointing exactly where these streets, houses, shops were. My classmates and I were able to out a path to walk, kind of like walking in the footsteps of history back then in Lasell to see what it was like, and then compare it to modern day doing the walk.
So after focusing our research to the physical space of Lasell, like the streets and buildings, Emily and I were researching how these buildings and classes were gendered spaces. So basically we were looking at like were men allowed on this all-female campus and in what roles, and we found out that most of the roles for males on campus were roles of power, like teachers and professors, just men that owned the school in general.
Obviously, it was an all-female school at the time, and so all of the students would be female, and I was picturing that visitors wouldn't be allowed under certain stipulations, specifically if they were men.
While searching for references to gender, it was pretty hard looking up male or man, but family gendered terms like father and brother came up with a lot more. This and the reference to a lot of the students at Lasell as daughters showed us that Lasell had this sort of homely environment, like it was an extension of the girls' homes.
So what we found was actually that no visitors were allowed without specific permission given by the preceptress, which we figured was almost like a residential director, someone who was in charge of the girls in the residential halls, which I thought was very interesting.
Lasell had a really intense curriculum back in the day, and a very different curriculum than what we see today. There was focus on hygiene, strict hygiene. There was focus on mental health. There was mental health breaks and picnics we found. Mandatory dentistry and dental health, mandatory vaccines and things like this. This was all super interesting, but I think the most interesting part of the curriculum was scientific housekeeping. This was a term they used to generally mean like making clothes, repairing clothes, cleaning a house, just being self-sufficient in owning a home.
I was picturing that a lot of the classes would be more gendered. So stuff like home economics, home sanitation, stuff like that. And we did find those classes, but what we also found was a lot of emphasis put on physical education and classical history, languages. So it was just really interesting to me that really the Lasell Seminary education in 1908 was geared towards making a well-rounded student. And so this well-rounded education prepared them for an independent life and providing for a husband and children, especially when the husband wasn't around. The ideal Lasell girl, the girl who's strong, her health unmarred, by foolish risks shall not be scarred. Her crew next spring on River Day, the others by her strength shall sway, until they win a hard-fought race. Ah, she is the one to set a pace for the ideal Lasell girl. The girl who works, no, not a grind, nor must she have a brilliant mind, but one who's not ashamed to say she has her lessons every day, or does at least her very best. She'll surely stand the hardest test of the ideal Lasell girl. The girl who's happy, full of fun, and in for play when work is done. She doesn't try to break a rule or tell how she would run the school if she were head with all the rest. She likes to show the life and zest of the ideal Lasell girl. The girl who helps is always there, with greeting smile a load to share. Unselfishly, she tries to give a helping hand each day to live. So someone's glad she scatters seeds. The harvest reaps a golden deed of the ideal Lasell girl.
Today, we don't really like to say to boys or girls, like, this is how, this is the right type of boy or girl to be. But that's like exactly what this poem is doing.
I feel like there was a weird disconnect of what it meant to be a woman back then and what it means to be a woman now.
And during our research, we didn't find any direct reference to students who today would identify as transgender and non-binary, but I'm sure that they existed back then, and that further research into this topic would be really interesting.
I didn't expect the ideal Lasell girl poem from a women's college. I definitely expected there to be more backlash towards stereotypical gender roles coming from a women's college, because they're all women aside from some of the professors. So I found this article about a lecture that Mrs. Mary A. Livermore had given to the Lasell students. And it was basically a reaction to this other lecture that she heard by an Englishman who had said basically that owing to war and the loss of men's lives in many other ways, there's a quote unquote surplus of women. And he says, quote, "And what is to be done with these superfluous women who can never hope to be married?" So he's basically saying that the only use for a woman is to be married to a man and have kids. In reaction, she says, "No woman is superfluous who finds work to do in the world and does it well. Neither sex can do without the other. It seems to have been the wish of the divine creator that these two should cooperate in the social and industrial, as in the domestic world, in perfect harmony, neither one being the head nor yet the foot, but that on an equality they should calmly and strongly work together." Basically, women and men are equal, and there's not really a such thing as a superfluous woman, because even if she's not married, she can impact society in a good way. So, I mean, this article isn't as surprising as the ideal Lasell girl poem. Women who went to college were progressive women who thought they could make something for themselves and not just be married, you know. Thinking about the article that I just referenced, when I was looking through it, it didn't really mention any activism or like suffragist movement kind of rhetoric within it, which I thought was interesting. And when you compare like the earlier Lasell leaves, of like the early 1900s, like 1900, 1902 kind of thing, and then you compare it to later, like 1908, you see more and more references to the suffragist movement. So it seems like it's getting picked up more and more on campus. They don't actually go in depth. They just say, oh, there was a lecture about this by a suffragette or suffragist, which is what they called. And they don't go into detail, which I thought was interesting. Was it that like they didn't want to promote it, or was it that it was just like not in the forefront of people's minds?
Although this research process was difficult at times, it was also very uplifting to find, from New Year's resolutions of students to even love letters or letters to professors, those types of evidence detailing the daily minutia of Lasell life back then. Just finding that daily minutia is so critical as a primary source to kind of build this historical narrative and for others to kind of appreciate the history back then, the rich history of back then.
Lasell's history is rich and very far from over. I'm proud that I got to be part of this amazing campus, and I'm very proud that we are now coeducational. This project has given me a newfound appreciation for the space and has given me so much new information as I give tours, as I attend classes, and even as I get to enter the Victorian mansions.